Between July 3 and August 29, 1992, 14 street hustlers turned up strangled, beaten, or simply gone inside decaying walk-ups across New York's northernmost borough, in what would become known as the Bronx tenement purge. All were low-level runners, all bound by cash, silence, and proximity to the Vega family's nightly take. The methods were unnervingly precisely night. Summons up narrow stairwells, padlocked rooms where music blared to drown struggle, bleach burning through the stink of old pipes. But the killers weren't rival crews, trigger-happy cops, or cartel emissaries sent to clean house. Instead, they were the Vegas themselves, moving like rumors through dark hallways, methodically selecting, luring, and erasing anyone suspected of skimming. Detectives in the NYPD's Organized Crime Control Bureau would later call the operation a domestic purge. Chilling in its calculation, and the motive wasn't territory, wasn't prestige, wasn't even revenge, it was fear, or suffocating fear that one light envelope would expose hidden fortunes and topple a carefully constructed empire. If you're ready to descend into this story, keep listening. Summer of '92 in the South Bronx didn't look like a place with secrets worth killing for. It looked tired. Brick tenements leaned toward the street like old men with bad knees, their faces tattooed with graffiti, their windows patched with cardboard and tape. Laundry lines sagged between fire escapes, t-shirts and baby onesies moving slow in the thick air. From a distance, it was just another block people drove past with their doors locked. At the corner of Prospect and Westchester Avenues, traffic never really slept, it just dozed. Buses sighed at the light, releasing hot air and the smell of diesel. Gypsy cabs rolled slow, their drivers scanning for last-minute fares. Kids in flat-brim caps sold loosies outside the bodega with the flickering red lotto sign. Above all that, 6 stories of soot, dark brick, watched in silence. Fire escapes, zigzagging like metal scars. Money moved differently on that corner than it did downtown. It changed hands on the stoop, in paper bags, inside jacket pockets, always cash, almost never receipts. The legal economy barely skimmed the surface paychecks from the hospital laundry. The bodega, the bus depot, while an invisible economy pulsed under it, made of numbers games, card tables, and quiet deals in stairwells. If you followed the path of a single dollar bill, you could watch it travel from a transit worker's hand to a dealer's pocket to a landlord's envelope before midnight. One of those envelopes belonged to the Vegas. Their building sat a half block off the corner. A 6-story walk-up with a busted intercom and a front door that preferred a shoulder over a key. Tenants called it Dona Vega's place even after Raphael died, because it was Elena Vega who walked the halls at dawn, who argued with Con Ed over bills, who slid written notices under doors in neat looping Spanish. Each Friday night, one thick unmarked envelope from the basement card room got folded into the rent stack on her kitchen table. Never declared, never discussed outside the family. On paper, Elena was just another small landlord inches from default. In practice, she sat at the center of a dense neighborhood web. She knew which kid's grandmother lived on the 3rd floor and which cousin worked nights at the bodega. She remembered who'd helped her shovel snow in '78 and who'd stiffed her on rent during the blackout. People brought her gossip without calling it that: complaints about noisy neighbors, whispers about new guys hanging by the door, questions about whether it was safe for teenagers to use the back stairs after dark. Every scrap went into a mental ledger as precise as the one in her rent book, a quiet accounting of loyalties, grudges, and favors owed. Street hustlers orbited that web without ever quite belonging to it. They worked the corner, not the building. They answered to men Elena never met, took orders from beepers she never saw. To them, the tenement was just cover from rain, a place where stairwells echoed with buyers' footsteps and cops' boots. To her, it was the only inheritance her family had, the only leverage keeping bank notices from turning into foreclosure signs. That difference, the corner's money versus the building's survival, was a fault line, running right under Prospect and Westchester, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Years later, When detectives mapped out the 14 bodies and the Vega family name beside them, they'd trace that line back to this corner. To this summer, to one night when an envelope came up light. If you want to understand how a family ends up weaponizing every relationship they have, watch this block a little longer. We're not at the first killing yet. We're just standing where it starts. And nothing looks like justice or murder. Not yet. Asterisk, inside the Vega apartment, the air always smelled faintly of fried garlic and old paper. The kitchen was narrow, the linoleum curling at the corners. But the table at its center might as well have been a boardroom desk. Rent envelopes lay in tight rubber-banded stacks, each one labeled in Elena's slanted hand, 3B, 5F, 2A. Beside them, a black marble composition notebook sat open, filled with lines of numbers and notes, the ink darker where the pen had paused to press. Across from her, Victor rubbed grease from under his fingernails with a paper towel. He'd come straight from the subway yard, shirt still smelling of oil and metal. "Ma, you gotta get that front door fixed," he said. "It sticks worse every week. Somebody's gonna sue when they twist an ankle." Elena didn't look up. "They've been threatening to sue me since '79, she answered. "Door still there. Judge still hasn't come to visit." Her tone was dry, not unkind. Further down the table, Manny counted smaller bills into piles of 20, his thumbs moving fast. He'd helped in the card room since he was 16, first sweeping floors, then running beers. Now keeping the books, no one would ever show a bank. The basement envelope fatter, on Fridays, thinner when cops lingered on the corner waited apart from the rent, its flap unmarked. "We did good last week," he said, not quite bragging. "Old heads stayed till 3. That envelope kept Con Ed off your back, Titty." Elena finally glanced over, eyes sharp. "It kept them off for 1 month, she corrected. Nobody gets lazy because of one envelope. What the IRS knew about the Vegas could have fit on a single sheet of paper. One small building. Decades-old mortgage, modest reported rent. What the neighborhood knew filled a whole different ledger. Tenants came to Elena with cash in hand and stories on their tongues. The lady from 4D, who slid half her rent across the table, also mentioned. New boys leaning on her grandson in the stairwell. The man from 1A, who owed 2 months and promised to catch up by fall, let slip that a cop on the night. Tora liked to drink free at a certain bar. Elena never wrote those details in her notebook. Not exactly. Instead, she made small marks only she could decode. Dots and dashes in the margins that turned gossip into a map. On the counter by the sink, an old beige phone sat beneath a list of numbers taped to the tile. Parish office, legal aid, housing department, the bodega. Each meant a person, not just a line. Father Miguel from St. Athanasius, who'd known her since Raphael's funeral. A legal aid attorney who used to live in 2C, now downtown, but still answering when Donna Vega called. The woman at housing who hated slumlords, but trusted Elena to fix leaks if given time. None of them would have said they were part of any network. They were just people who owed her a favor. Or believed her when she said a complaint was real. By 9 most nights, Lila would drift in from her room, schoolbooks under one arm, headphones around her neck. She'd kiss Elena's cheek, wrinkle her nose at the cigarette smoke seeping in from the hallway, and ask, "You still doing numbers down here?" Elena would tap the notebook. "These numbers keep you in that bedroom," she'd reply. "You want to study somewhere with bars on the window." Lila always rolled her eyes, but she stayed close, listening to talk of boilers and broken mailboxes, and who was late again this month. Nothing about that kitchen looked dangerous. A stranger would have seen an old woman guarding a shaky livelihood, a family doing their best in a bad zip code. No one glancing through the doorway that summer would have guessed that the phone numbers on the wall and the marks in Elena's margins were the first pieces of a strategy that had, one day, stripped 14 men of shelter, work, and protection. The envelope at the edge of the table still felt solid in her hand. It hadn't come up light yet. But the system to defend it, to defend everything, was already there, waiting for the day it would be needed. Asterisk. That day it was needed arrived on a Friday, hot enough that the hallway walls sweated. By 10 p.m., The basement card room was full. The low ceiling trapping cigarette smoke, and the sour temps of cheap whiskey. A box fan rattled on a milk crate, barely moving the air. Men in work boots and pressed shirts leaned over the folding tables, cards snapping, bills slapping felt. Above them, pipes hummed with the building's tired plumbing. Water rushing whenever someone upstairs flushed. At the back, Manny watched the flow like he always did. His chair sat against the cinder block wall, close enough to see every hand, far enough to pretend he wasn't watching. New faces had slipped in over the past few weeks. Cousins from down the block, guys devouched for they were younger, sneakers to clean, laughter a little too loud. Manny didn't love it, but the old regulars said they played square, and the pot had been bigger since they showed up. Near midnight, Alina came down the narrow stairs, one hand on the rail. The air hit her like a wall smoke, sweat, alcohol, a hint of mildew from the boiler room. She paused, just outside the open door, taking in the scene without stepping fully inside. It wasn't her world, not really, but its money kept the lights on. Manny caught her eye, lifted his chin, and she answered with the smallest nod. Everything looked under control. From her spot, she could see D in the corner. Shoulders relaxed, one hand draped over the back of his chair as he watched his boys lose and win in turn. By 3 in the morning, the last hand was dealt. The last argument over a split pot settled. Chairs scraped back, pockets bulged with folded bills. The room emptied in small burst twos and threes heading up the stairs, their laughter fading between floors. Manny stayed behind with one of the older men to count the house share. They worked in silence, just the soft slap of bills and the occasional creak from somewhere in the building as pipes cooled. When they were done, Manny rubber banded the stack and weighed it in his palm. It felt wrong. Lighter than last week, when there'd been fewer players. He ran the numbers again, lips moving. Same rake, same side bets, more people at the tables. The envelope should have been thicker. A knot tightened under his sternum. You sure you've scooped every pot? He asked the older man. You saw me, the guy said, tired, rubbing his eyes. I didn't miss a damn thing. Manny didn't argue. He just slipped the money into the manila envelope, smoothed the flap, and walked it upstairs. Alina was at the table when he came in. Robe tied at the waist, glasses perched low on her nose. The rent envelopes were already stacked to one side. She held out her hand without a word. Manny placed the basement envelope in her palm. It sagged differently than it should have. Years of handling cash had made her fingers into scales. She didn't need to open it to know it was light. Still, she peeled it open, counted quickly, then counted again slower. It's wrong, Manny said, throat dry. We had a good night. Better than last week. Alina didn't answer right away. Outside, a siren wailed down Westchester, fading into the distance. The fridge motor kicked on with a low hum. How many of Dee's boys were there? She finally asked. Manny named them, one by one, feeling his stomach drop with each name. Every man, he said, was someone who knew where the money came from, who knew the building depended on this room staying quiet and profitable and invisible. A light envelope was just paper and ink, numbers that didn't add up. But to Alina, staring at the rubber band biting into 2 thin bills, it felt like a hand closing around her throat. If word of skimming spread upward to suppliers, to people who already distrusted small landlords, it wouldn't just be about a missing cut. It would invite bigger eyes onto the Vega building's finances, onto the years of undeclared cash that had kept them floating. That night, for the first time, fear outweighed habit at Elena's kitchen table, and fear, in that place and time, always looked for something or someone to cut loose. Sleep didn't do much for Alina that night. When the sun finally pushed a thin strip of light across the kitchen tiles, the envelope was still on the table, thinner than it ought to be, like it had been emptied of more than cash. By 8 a.m. she was walking up the cracked stone steps of St. Athanasius, the city already humming behind her, bus brakes shrieking on Southern Boulevard. A radio thumping from a parked car. Inside the church, the air was 10 degrees cooler and smelled of wax and old wood. Candles flickered before the saints, glass jars clouded with soot. An oscillating fan clicked on its stand with every swing. Alina slid into a side pew, knees protesting, and let the murmur of early mass voices wash over her. When Father Miguel's words reached, "Forgive us our trespasses," something in her chest tightened. Skimming was trespass. So was hiding income for 20 years. Fear didn't fit neatly into any line of the prayer, but it sat on her anyway, heavy as a hand. After the final hymn, she waited until the last old lady shuffled past the holy water, then caught the priest in the aisle. "Padre," she said, "Lo, what do you tell someone who's scared of what the truth might cost?" He studied her face a moment, sweat glistening at his hairline. "Truth costs either way, Alina," he answered. "The question is, who pays?" She nodded like she accepted that, but walking back into the heat. She knew what he didn't. In her world, it wasn't God deciding who paid. It was whoever held the most strings. Later that week, those strings were spread across the back pew, like a paper rosary. Manny had scribbled names and nicknames on loose notebook pages. Marisol, quieter, had added addresses, cross streets, bits of information she'd pulled from loose talk in the hallway. Victor sat stiff beside them, arms folded, eyes darting toward the altar as if expecting Father Miguel to appear and scold them for turning a pew into a planning table. Alina pointed with a knuckle. "Him," she said, tapping one name. "He stays with his aunt on Avenue St. John. Aunt's on Section 8. You know what happens if housing hears he's running business from that apartment?" Marisol swallowed. "They pull the voucher," she said. "She loses the unit." Alina didn't smile. "She'll throw him out herself before that happens." Tension crackled in that hushed space, sacred air thickening with secular anger. Manny wanted simpler solutions. "We could just talk to them," he muttered. "Real talk. Let them know you don't steal from family." Victor snorted. "And if they laugh in your face," he said, "you gonna swing on 14 guys, Manny?" The younger man's jaw clenched. "I know people," he shot back. "It wouldn't have to be me." Alina cut across them. "No," she said. "Nobody's bringing guns into this. Bullets are loud. Paper is quiet." Her rules came out measured, like she was reciting a recipe. They would not touch a weapon. They would not lie on any form. They would not plant anything in anybody's apartment. Instead, they'd pick up the phone. They'd call probation officers with real concerns. They'd file housing complaints about actual overcrowding. They'd talk to landlords, pastors, and bosses who didn't want police in their lobbies. Every move had to be traceable to something true, so that if anyone ever looked back, it would look like the system had simply noticed. From the end of the pew, Leela listened, pretending to read a pamphlet about youth retreats. Her headphones hung idle around her neck, the church's faint echo swallowing the city noise. She heard names she recognized from the stoop, men who'd whistled at her friends or blocked the door. When Alina said, "We cut the ropes one by one until they got nobody left to hold them," Lila pictured actual rope, fraying over a drop. She couldn't see what nobody at that moment imagined what even with all her ledgers and grudges, didn't fully grasp was how far a person falls once those ropes are gone. The plan in that back pew didn't include strangled bodies in abandoned hallways or families lighting candles over closed caskets. It was, in their minds, a clean thing. Use the network they had to squeeze out the men who'd put their whole life at risk. Years later, detectives would circle that morning at St. Athanasius on their timeline and call it what it really was. The first act in a slow legal strangling of 14 human beings. Asterisk. By the following Monday, the plan from the back pew had already taken its first step off paper. Instead of heading straight home from an early shift, Alina got off the bus 2 stops early and walked toward a low concrete building on 161st, where the city kept its probation office. The lobby smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner. A TV bolted to the wall, murmuring daytime talk shows while people shifted on plastic chairs, clutching folders and summons slips. Behind a long counter, a woman in a blue cardigan said, "Next," without looking up. Alina waited her turn, then slid a folded piece of paper across the scratched surface. "I want to leave information for an officer," she said. The woman finally glanced up, taking in the gray hair pulled into a bun, the worn but clean dress. "You got a name?" she asked. "For the officer or the client?" Alina answered. When the clerk realized both were written their officer's last name, client's full name, date of birth, her eyebrows arched just slightly. Upstairs, fluorescent lights hummed over a grid of cubicles. Officer Reyes wiped powdered sugar from his tie and frowned at the pink message slip on his desk. Anonymous call. Concerns about spider morales, one of his more aggravating cases. Late to check-ins, always one excuse away from a violation. The note mentioned possible drug dealing in a specific building and associates hanging with a crew tied to violence. Reyes didn't care much about neighborhood politics, but he cared about not having his name on a file if something went bad. He called Spider in for an emergency appointment. Spider came in smelling like sweat and cheap cologne, baseball cap in his hands. "You got people calling on you?" Reyes said, tapping the folder. "You don't want to go back upstate. You better stay clean and stay away from that building on Prospect." Spider laughed it off. "Man, people always hating," he said. "You know how they do." Reyes didn't smile. "Miss one more check-in, or, I hear you've been near that address again. I violate you," he replied. "You think about that next time your boys want to hang in that lobby." The meeting lasted 15 minutes. Spider left with his jaw tight, phone already in his palm. On the way down the stairs, he punched in a beeper code, fingers jabbing the keys. Outside, heat bounced off the pavement. Car horns blared in short, angry bursts. When his supplier called back from a payphone, Spider hissed into the receiver, "Somebody snitching on me, talking to probation, talking to housing. They saying my name with your spot." The voice on the other end went flat. "We can't have that," it said. "We'll talk." Same building as before. Midnight. The abandoned tenement to Avenues over had been empty since a fire in '88. Boards covered most of the windows. Graffiti scrolling across the plywood like a second skin. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint sour ghost of old smoke. Water dripped somewhere in the dark, each drop echoing down the stairwell. At 12:03 a.m. on July 3rd, Spider pushed the door open, sneakers scuffing on cracked tile. Music pounded from a boombox on the second floor. Bass heavy enough to rattle loose plaster. No one living nearby heard much after that. Maybe there was an argument, muffled by the beat. Maybe there was a plea, cut short. What the crime scene photos show is what came next. Spider on the hallway floor, neck bruised in a dark ring, eyes staring at a peeling ceiling. Bleach streaked the concrete near his head, splashed up the wall in hurried swipes. The boombox still played until the batteries died. Some R&B track warped and slow as the tape dragged. Patrol officers found him hours later after a vague, anonymous call reported a body. Probably ODD. The first detective on scene, a tired man with a coffee stain on his shirt, stood over the corpse and squinted at the faint chemical smell. "Somebody gave a damn about Prince," he muttered. "But not about him." There was nothing in Spider's pockets but a few crumpled bills and a probation appointment card. On the report form, under known associates, his link to a loose crew near Prospect and Westchester went down in ballpoint ink. No one wrote Vega anywhere on that paper. Yet the chain was already there. A landlord's fear, a priest's warning, a folded note at a clerk's desk, a probation officer covering his own back, a supplier protecting his. One rope had been cut. 13 more still held. Down in the Bronx County morgue. The cold didn't feel like regular cold. It seeped through clothes, crawled under skin, made fingers clumsy. A radio on the counter whispered soft oldies, tinny, through cheap speakers, as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Spider's body lay on a steel table, a white sheet pulled to his collarbone. A toe tag swinging gently when someone brushed past. Dr. Neha Patel snapped on gloves, the latex popping at her wrists. She'd seen bodies from fires, shootings, car wrecks on the Cross Bronx. One more dead young man from the projects didn't usually stir anything. Still, the ligature marks made her pause. They were clean, almost neat, a dark band around his throat without the messy scrapes of a panicked struggle down a stairwell. She leaned closer, catching a faint chemical sting. "That's bleach," she said, mostly to herself. Detective Ramos stood a few feet back, coffee in hand, pretending he wasn't watching every move. "OD, call my ass," he muttered. "Who strangles a guy and then mops up?" Dr. Patel didn't answer. She lifted Spider's hands, peered at the fingernails, the knuckles. "Minimal defensive wounds," she observed. He trusted whoever was close enough to get a rope around him. Or he was already out. She dictated notes to the recorder, voice flat but precise. Under cause of death, she logged asphyxiation by ligature strangulation. Under other notable findings, she added chemical odor consistent with sodium hypochlorite present on skin and clothing. Across the river, while the autopsy tools clinked against metal, Alina sat at her kitchen table again, the newspaper folded beside her. Spider's death got 2 lines in the crime blotter. Male, 24, found unconscious, pronounced dead at scene. No arrests. Manny traced the ink with his thumb. "That's him," he said. "They really did it." His voice held something like awe and something like dread. Alina didn't look at the paper. "We didn't kill anybody," she replied. "We just stopped carrying them." Human cost didn't show up in her ledger the way past due rent did. It lived in other apartments. In 2D, Spider's mother sat on the edge of her couch, TV flickering blue across her face, phone silent on the coffee table. Neighbors had already come by with foil-covered plates and awkward hugs. They said, he was trying, and he wasn't a bad kid, just got caught up. No one said out loud that he'd run with D, that he'd sold on their stairs. Grief had its own omerta. Another name, though, went down in Elena's notebook that week. Luis Shorty Mendez. He'd been a regular in the card room once, running beers and ashtrays when he was barely out of high school, before D pulled him into corner work. As far as the state was concerned, Shorty was a dishwasher at a diner near the Grand Concourse, paying taxes on minimum wage. As far as Alina was concerned, he'd laughed too hard when Manny mentioned the light envelope dot in a small office behind the diner's kitchen. The manager frowned at a fax that had rolled out of the machine. It wasn't on city letterhead, just a typed page with bullet points. Repeated lateness. Observed dealing near the back entrance. Potential liability for the business if police linked employees to narcotics. Attached was a photocopy of a handwritten complaint, anonymously filed, listing the date and time a short male employee had exchanged packets in the alley. The manager knew faxes could be faked, but he also knew margins were thin and cops nosy. When Shorty showed up late again, smelling faintly of weed, his boss sighed. "We're cutting back," he said. "Can't keep you on." Shorty's slide was faster than Spider's. No job meant no steady cash, which meant he leaned harder on street work. His girlfriend, 6 months pregnant, begged him to slow down. "We can't be doing this when the baby comes," she whispered in the dark. He made promises he couldn't keep. 15 days after Spider's autopsy, Dr. Patel stood over another table. Same age bracket, same neighborhood ties, same ring of bruises. This time, the body had been found hanging from a belt looped over a closet rod in a flophouse hotel. The scene hastily wiped, bleach streaks on the carpet. On her recorder, she said, "Manner of death? Undetermined, suspicious for homicide." Off tape, she looked at Ramos and said quietly, "It's not just one." He nodded, throat tight. "Somebody's cleaning their own house," he replied. Neither of them knew yet how many rooms that house had, or how neatly someone had been cutting its ropes. On the 4th floor of a drab municipal building on Jerome Avenue, the Housing Preservation and Development Office sounded like every other overworked agency in the city. Phones rang in uneven bursts, keyboards clacked, the printer coughed out paper that no one picked up right away. Fluorescent lights flattened everyone's faces into the same pale color. A line of tenants and landlords snaked past a bulletin board covered in curling flyers about lead paint and free clinics at the counter. Alina slid a folded complaint form under the glass. She'd taken the time to print it cleanly on her own typewriter. Address of a 5-story walk-up in apartment number, description of chronic overcrowding, and possible unauthorized subletting. The clerk, bored, skimmed the lines. "You live there?" she asked. "I own on that block," Alina replied. which wasn't quite a lie. Her cousin did. My relatives worried. Too many mattresses. Too many strange men. Across the room, Inspector Morales thumbed through a stack of new assignments, eyes gritty from too little sleep. Most complaints were vague: mice, heat, no hot water. One caught his attention with its specificity. Apartment 3C, 2-bedroom, 6 adult males reported. Additional cots in hallway, possible fire hazard. He recognized the landlord's name, a small timer already on thin ice for ignoring boiler violations. Jesus, he muttered. You people never learn. He penciled in an emergency inspection for the end of the week. During Friday's inspection, the hallway reeked of fried onions and cheap incense. Morales knocked, announced himself, flashed his badge. A tired woman in a housecoat cracked the door, eyes darting past him to the clipboard. Inside he counted fast: 1 official tenant, her teenage son, and at least 3 grown men pretending not to live there. Extra mattresses leaned against the wall, a duffel bag half-zipped under the couch. Every answer he got came a beat too slow. He wrote the citation anyway, no joy in his hand. Back down on the sidewalk, the woman's anger exploded. You and your friends gotta go, she snapped at the 2 cousins, as soon as Morales drove off. I'm not losing my voucher because you like to play gangster. Pito and Flacco stared, stunned. We're family, one protested. Your rent, she shot back. By nightfall, they were stuffing clothes into trash bags, cursing under their breath about snitches and jealous neighbors, planning to crash with a contact over in Mott Haven where the landlord didn't ask questions. Around the same time, on a vinyl chair in a crowded prenatal clinic waiting room, Shorty's girlfriend stared at the sonogram photo in her lap. The nurse had talked about stress, about blood pressure, about needing calm. Calm was a word that didn't fit her life anymore. Marisol sat 2 seats over, pretending to read a magazine, ears catching every sniffled word into the payphone when the young woman called someone to say, they took his job. They keep hassling him. I'm scared, Mummy. Guilt slid under Marisol's skin like a splinter. Inside the HPD office the following Wednesday, a friendly clerk Alina had known since the blackout slid a copy of the violation across the counter. Landlord's on notice, she said quietly. If he doesn't clear those extra bodies out, we can move to pull the subsidy. Alina glanced at the paper long enough to see the bold code section. He'll clear them, she murmured. He likes his checks. In her mind, 2 more ropes on DS side, frayed. The cousins would land somewhere, they just wouldn't be under a protected roof. Back at the precinct, Detective Ramos tacked a second photo onto the squad room corkboard beside Spider's. Same age range, same neighborhood radius, same careful bleach. Red string connected them to a scribbled note, associate of decaying crew. His lieutenant watched from the doorway, arms folded. You think this is just internal beef? He asked. Ramos shrugged, uneasy. Feels bigger, he said, like somebody's turning off the lights on them, 1 floor at a time. Talk of looping and organized crime hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Evening settled over Prospect and Westchester with a purple haze, headlights smearing across wet asphalt after a brief storm. Pito and Flacco hauled their trash bags up another dim staircase in another tired building. This one closer to the river and further from anyone who'd call 911 if things went bad. In the Vega lobby, neighbors whispered that these people were thinning out, that some had caught bodies or caught bad luck. Alina listened from her door, face unreadable. No one on that block understood yet that luck had very little to do with where those men were being pushed. Asterisk. What changed next wasn't loud enough for the block to notice. It started with letters. Pale green envelopes from Human Resources Administration, white envelopes from Social Security, off-white from the Department of Labor. They all came from the same anonymous glass tower downtown on 14th Street. The kind of place most of Dee's crew never set foot in unless a girlfriend dragged them. To Alina though, that building was as real a weapon as any gun. Inside the HRA Income Support Center, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the press of body. Numbers blinked on a red LED board, calling clients to plexiglass windows where caseworkers squinted at screens. A security guard leaned against a wall, eyes half closed, radio crackling softly at his shoulder. Marisol sat on a plastic chair by the far wall, a manila folder on her lap, waiting for her interview like any other applicant. Only the folder didn't hold pay stubs. It held printouts. Earlier that week, the legal aid attorney who used to live in 2C had let her sit at an unused desk, fingers clumsy on a fax machine. Together, they'd pulled public records eviction filings, arrest logs, old benefit applications. Now, those pages lay in her folder, neatly clipped, each one highlighting a discrepancy. A man reporting no income while flashing fresh jewelry. Another claiming to live alone in an apartment that 3 different crews used as a crash pad. When her number flashed on the board, she stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked to window 7. The caseworker behind the glass looked bored until he saw the name on the first highlighted form. "You're not him," he said. "I'm his aunt," Marisol lied easily, accent softening. "He's not here. But I'm worried he's gonna get in trouble. He's been lying on his papers. He's running with the wrong people. I don't want them taking the baby's food away because of him." She let her voice wobble just enough. The worker glanced at the papers again, then at her face. He'd heard worse stories. He'd also seen worse fraud. Eventually, he sighed. "We'll flag the case for review," he said. "Somebody look." Within 10 days, 2 of Dee's lieutenants got notices in their mailboxes, requests for in-person recertification, warnings about possible overpayment and benefit suspension pending documentation. At the same time, an anonymous tip reached the unemployment office about a man collecting checks while doing off-the-book security for a known dealer. None of it looked coordinated on paper. To the systems, each action was just a file moving into a different pile. Dee felt the tightening without seeing the hands on the rope. First it was Flacho calling to say his aunt had tossed him. HPD was breathing down her neck. Then Pudge, his most reliable lookout, grumbled that his food stamps got cut for no reason, just as a landlord in Mott Haven stuck a 3-day notice on his door. Guys who'd once swaggered now lingered at payphones longer. Voices low, asking favors from men who'd stopped returning calls. Debt stacked higher every day, a corner didn't produce enough. Suppliers didn't care about HRA letters or HPD inspections. They cared about money. Toward the end of August, with the heat hanging heavy, even at midnight, Dee stood in a phone booth near the river, plastic receiver slick in his palm. On the other end, his connect's voice was ice. "You're losing people," the man said. "You losing apartments. You bringing police and city eyes to buildings that were quiet. That's sloppiness." Dee swallowed, tracking the headlights sliding by on the FDR. "It's not me," he said. "Somebody's playing games with us. I just need a little time to straighten it." The line cut him off. "Tomorrow," the voice said. "We talk." Same spot. Waterfront warehouses on the Hunts Point side had their own smell at night. Salt, rot, and old diesel. Rats skittered between pallets, the river licking at pilings in slow, sticky waves. Dee walked there just before 1 a.m., sneakers scuffing on broken concrete, a tightness between his shoulder blades. No one from the block saw him go. No one saw if he met anyone. What the record shows is simpler. He wasn't seen alive again. Dawn slid into the Bronx the way it always did. Gray first, then weak gold, catching on glass shards and bottle caps in the gutter. In the Vega building, Alina made her usual rounds, slippers whispering over the scuffed stairs. The hallway felt different, lighter, somehow. No cluster of men by the mailboxes. No voices bouncing off the walls. Just the hum of someone's TV, and the rattle of pipes as a shower turned on. On the 6th floor landing, she stopped, hand on the railing, and listened to the quiet. Her network had done what bullets often failed to do. Cleared a crew without a single shot fired in her building. 14 men were dead or disappeared across 8 weeks. And all the official paperwork showed were inspections, benefit recertifications, probation notes, and a handful of anonymous complaints. Standing in that early morning stillness, Alina finally let out the breath she'd been holding since the light envelope. Relief tasted like metal on her tongue. Somewhere under it, something else stirred, something that wasn't victory. Not exactly, but would take years to name. Asterisk, by early September, the stack of dead bodies had grown too tall to ignore. What started as a weird strangling in an abandoned building and an undetermined hanging in a flophouse began to echo in other precincts. A runner found in a stairwell in Highbridge, another dumped behind a warehouse near the Harlem River, bleach always somewhere in the story. Different call signs on the radio, same tired shock when uniforms rolled the gurneys out. Across the East River, at one police plaza, the Organized Crime Control Bureau took its cases in through a different door. Their squad room was higher up, the windows smaller, the air tasting of burnt coffee and the ghost of old cigarettes. Maps of the 5 boroughs covered one wall, pushpins blooming in red and black clusters, bulletin boards sagged under photos, surveillance shots, copies of warrants clipped in overlapping layers, pinned to a corkboard near the center. Someone had put up Spider's photo and Shorty's beside him, joined by a red string that looped through their last known hangouts. Detective Ramos stood there with a folder in his hand, arguing quietly with a plainclothes sergeant from another precinct. "Look at the neck bruising," Ramos said. "Look at the bleach. That's not corner beef, Sarge. That's systematic." The other man squinted. "Our guy was Puerto Rican," he said. "Yours is Dominican." Different crews. Ramos tapped the map. Same for block radius. Same summer, same connection to one name, D. Cole. When analysts finally pulled the homicide logs for June through August, patterns leaped off the page. Age range, race, known affiliations, methods. 14 names, some marked missing, presumed dead, all with some documented tie to D's loose group probation files. Arrest reports, field interview cards where officers had scribbled "seen with Cole" on a legal pad. ANOCCB lieutenant wrote in block letters, "Bronx tenement purge," and underlined it twice. Down the hall, in a windowless room lit by buzzing fluorescents, a crime analyst named Ortiz spread photocopies across a table. She'd pulled more than just homicide reports. There were housing inspections, HRA recertification notices, unemployment fraud investigation memos. Most weren't public, but OCCB had friends in other departments. She circled dates with a red pen. "You seeing this?" she asked Ramos when he stepped in. "Spider gets that emergency probation meeting on the 1st, he's dead on the 3rd. Shorty gets flagged for benefit review the same week his girl says he lost his job, Pito and Flacco. HPD violation. Then their names pop up in narcotics intel as moving to a hotter building. Every time one of these guys loses something, housing, income, slack, they're dead or gone inside 10 days. Ortiz flipped one page back and forth, frowning. "Somebody's pulling strings," she said. "Not just on the street. In the bureaucracy." Ramos leaned against the table, the overhead light cutting harsh shadows across his face. "You think it's cops?" he asked. "Some cowboy project?" She shook her head. "If it was cops, they wouldn't bother with HRA letters. This feels domestic. Like someone who knows how agencies talk to each other. Like somebody's using the system the way other people use a gun." When reporters later tried to pry details from internal memos, most of this never made it past black marker. But what did surface shows OCCB briefly considered the idea of a benefit vigilante or a pissed-off rival landlord. They flagged one address in particular, a 6-story walk-up half a block off Prospect and Westchester, where 3 of the dead had given relatives locations, where probation and housing complaints seemed to start, where an anonymous caller had reported disturbances. The same week, the first envelope went light. Within days, Elena's building had a quiet star beside it on OCCB's map. There was no probable cause for a raid, no recorded threats, nothing that would stand up to a judge. All they had was gravity bodies and paper, all sliding toward that one address. From your side of the screen, decades later, you can see the shape of it more clearly than they did then. A family at the center of a web, tugging on benefits, inspections, and parole until the web collapsed on 14 men. Before we walk into the detective's first visit to the Vega building, if you value this kind of deep, uncomfortable dive into real cases, consider subscribing and sharing. Stories like this don't get easier next. They just get clearer. Asterisk. By the time Ramos came back with a warrant notebook and a bigger team, the Vega building had a red star beside it on the OCCB case map. On paper, it was still just a 6-story walk up half a block off Prospect and Westchester. In the squad room, though, it had become a gravitational center. Every line on the whiteboard bending toward that address like metal to a magnet. They hit the block in an unmarked sedan and a battered Caprice, parking crooked near the hydrant. The late afternoon sun bounced hard off windshields. A hydrant down the street sprayed a crooked arc where kids shouted and slapped at the water. In the Vega lobby, the air felt thicker, like the building knew it was being watched. Same sagging mailboxes, same "Don't buzz late" sign. But now, the detectives carried a whole summer's worth of bodies in their heads. Alina met them halfway up the first flight. Keys hanging from her neck, chin up. News traveled fast. Someone at the bodega had already stepped in, murmuring, "Police from downtown. Asking your name, Donna." She'd had just enough time to wipe crumbs from the table and set out 3 glasses of water. "You gentlemen lost again?" she asked. "Or, you finally came to fix my elevator?" Ramos showed his shield properly this time. "Organized crime, ma'am. We'd like to ask a few more questions about some men who used to spend time in your building." The kitchen turned into a kind of unofficial interview room. No tape recorder, not yet, just notebooks and the steady rattle of the box fan in the window. O'Leary leaned back enough to see the list of phone numbers taped to the tile parish office. Legal aid, housing, HRA, Social Security, even the number for the local council member. It looked, to a casual eye, like a grandmother's cheat sheet. To an investigator who'd been reading complaints and call logs for weeks, it looked like a switchboard. "We've got 14 dead," Ramos said, voice low. "Every single one of them linked somehow to Darius Cole, and most of them to this block. Before they died, their lives started coming apart. Housing benefits, probation, jobs. Those problems start right around the time anonymous calls and forms start coming out of this building. You see why we're here." Alina met his gaze. "People call a lot of places from here," she replied. "They call Con Ed. They call immigration. They call the church. You gonna blame me for that too?" Downstairs, 2 other detectives walked the halls, knocking on doors. They showed residents a sheet of photos. Responses came in fragments. "Yeah, he used to lean on the mailbox. He played cards in the basement, I think. Those boys. Nah, they don't come round no more." Donna told them to keep it moving. No one claimed to have seen stranglings. No one admitted hearing fights in padlocked rooms. When asked who organized the tenant meeting that produced a neat packet of complaints last month, 3 different people said the same name, Alina. She gets things done. Back at one police plaza that night, analyst Ortiz laid everything out like a crime scene: probation notes, HPD violations, HRA flags, unemployment investigations. She marked dates with a red pen, then drew thin blue lines back to phone numbers and fax headers. Legal aid fax, originated from a machine once registered to Apartment to C, Vega building. Housing complaint, filed from the parish office number 2 blocks away. The same place Alina chaired a safety meeting. Benefit, fraud tip, anonymous. But the payphone it came from sat right outside the bodega where she bought her plantones every Friday. "None of this is illegal," Ortiz said, half to herself, calling about code violations, about overcrowding, about fraud. That's what agencies want. But when you put it all together, she gestured at the dates. April, complaints about these guys loitering. June, skimming at the card game. July through August, wave of administrative hits on his whole crew, and then they start turning up dead. Somebody decided to turn every dial they could reach. The phrase network knockout never appeared in an official memo. Internally, they called it network pressure, originating from Vega address. It meant the same thing. Whoever lived at that address understood how poor men lived on thin institutional ice, and knew exactly where to jump to crack it. In the case log, a new line went under possible motives: landlord protecting asset, family income from crew, skimming. orchestrated use of city systems to isolate targets. At the top of the page, written in block capitals, sat the name they kept circling back to, Elena Vega, matriarch. For prosecutors, it still wasn't enough. Conspiracy needs more than timing and phone records. For Ramos, though, the picture felt complete in a different way. Maybe the Vegas had never wrapped a belt around anyone's throat. Maybe they'd never touched a bottle of bleach. But if you strip 14 men of housing, work, and slack in the middle of a violent trade, are you really just calling the right officers? Or are you loading the gun and handing it to someone else? Asterisk, when the flyers went up about a block safety forum, most people assumed it'd be another talk about car break-ins and loitering. Something to nod through before hurrying home. The community center on Longwood Avenue smelled of pine sol and old coffee. Metal chairs scraped on the floor as residents and shop owners filed in. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while a box fan in the corner moved air in slow arcs. On the stage, a folding table held a plastic pitcher of water and a stack of paper cups. Ramos stood near the back wall, plainclothes blending in with the handful of other outsiders to officers in polo shirts. A housing rep, someone from the council member's office. He watched faces instead of the printed agenda. Crime trends, tenant rights. Working with police. When the moderator called Alina up as our longtime building owner and community liaison, a ripple moved through the room. The kind you get when half the audience has borrowed sugar from the person now at the mic. She didn't give speeches so much as she talked, like she was on the stoop. You all know, she began, hands resting on the table. We had problems this summer. Boys in the hallway, men on the steps who didn't live there. You were scared to let your grandbabies run to the bodega. Heads nodded in the room. A woman in the second row murmured, "Amen," under her breath. What she didn't say, what sat unsaid between every sentence, was that many of those boys were now names on the wall at OCCB. I did what I always do, she continued. I filled out forms. I asked for help to keep the building decent. No more, no less. To most of the crowd, that sounded like common sense. A landlord who actually dialed housing when the hallways filled with strangers was rare. Worth applause. In the third row though, a face tightened at some phrases. Shorty's girlfriend sat with her hands on her belly, now flat under a loose shirt. The miscarriage had come and gone in August in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant. She listened as neighbors praised Alina for cleaning up the building and felt a widening cold where fury should have been. When the floor opened for comments, she stood on shaking legs. My man is dead, she said, voice raw. You all talk about the hallway being quiet now, about feeling safe, but you don't say his name, or any of their names. Somebody decided they didn't deserve to live here, didn't deserve help, and now they're gone. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable, a few people staring at their shoes. One older man muttered that nobody told them to hustle, earning him a sharp look from a woman beside him. From the side of the room, Father Miguel, collar askew, cleared his throat. We can hold two truths, he offered. We can be grateful children aren't stepping over dealers in stairwells, and we can mourn boys who made terrible choices and still didn't deserve to die, strangled in hallways. His eyes flicked toward Alina. The question is, who gets to decide the price of safety? Afterward, as chairs scraped and people drifted toward the door, Ramos lingered by the coffee urn. He'd just watched the room split without anyone shouting on one side. Folks who felt the Vegas had finally done what cops wouldn't. On the other, families who saw only sons and cousins erased. That fracture mattered. Cases lived or died on witnesses. And this block was already choosing which truths to keep inside their own walls. For Elena's strategy, the meeting was its own kind of test. If neighbors had turned on her, the network she'd built priests, tenants, legal aid alumna could have unraveled under OCCB pressure. Instead, the evening ended in a murky middle ground. Enough gratitude to shelter her. Enough anger to keep the dead from fading entirely. In that uneasy balance, her network knockout held. The city had its suspicions. The block had its own. Neither side, yet, was ready to give her up. 2 weeks after the community forum, the knock came before dawn. It wasn't the lazy rap of a neighbor looking for sugar. It was the flat, insistent pounding that pushes through dreams and lands in the chest. Alina sat up before the second volley, joints protesting, heart oddly steady. In the hallway, red and blue light strobed through the frosted glass, painting the walls in brief, sickly colors. Victor opened the door in a t-shirt and sweats, squinting into a hallway filled with badges and nylon jackets that said NYPD and organized crime in block letters. From the kitchen doorway, Lila watched officers move like a practiced wave through the apartment, one to the back room, one to Manny's door, one to the fire escape. Paper rustled as a sergeant read out the warrants. Tax evasion, illegal gambling, possession of unlicensed gaming equipment. No one said murder. Not yet. Handcuffs clicked shut around wrists that had held envelopes and rent receipts for decades. Alina asked for a minute to put on shoes. A young officer hesitated, then nodded. "Ma'am, you'll get your shoes," he said, "but you're coming with us." On the ride downtown, the city slid by behind fingerprint-smudged glass. Sunrise turned the elevated tracks along Westchester into a silhouette. Trash trucks groaned at the curb, workers in reflective vests blinking against the light. Manny stared at his cuffed hands, jaw tight, whispering, "They're gonna pin those bodies on us." Victor answered without looking up. "They don't have that," he said. "They got paper." "That's what this is." Alina kept her gaze on the window, counting intersections like beads. She'd walked into city buildings 100 times to file forms and ask for help. This was the first time she was being taken in as the problem. Down in the bowels of one police plaza. The interrogation rooms smelled of coffee, sweat, and old fear. Cinderblock walls closed in under buzzing fluorescent lights, paint peeling in hairline cracks. A metal table anchored the small space, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. Alina sat in the single chair, hands free now, but resting palm down, as if bracing for a wave. Ramos entered with an assistant district attorney in a navy suit, a thin folder in her hands. "Mrs. Vega," the adder began. Voice cool, "You know why you're here." Elena's eyes flicked to the one-way glass. "You think I killed those boys," she said. "Or, you want me to say, I did, so your folder looks pretty." Before any answer came, the door opened again. A man in his 30s, tie loosened, legal aid badge clipped to his belt, leaned in. "Questioning stops," he said. "She asked for counsel the second you put her in holding." His face was familiar. 20 years ago, he'd carried a mattress up to 3F, fresh out of law school, rent paid in cash to Elena's palm. Ramos exhaled, annoyed but unsurprised. The network she'd built on rent receipts and neighborly favors now wore a suit and carried case law in his head. "You remember me, don't you?" The lawyer asked quietly. "You made sure they fixed my radiator. Let me return something." While Alina sat in one gray room, her name moved through other, brighter spaces. Father Miguel called a contact at the council member's office, framing her as a community anchor caught in an overbroad sweep. Tenants who'd once signed complaints at her urging now signed character letters, emphasizing her efforts to keep the building safe. A cousin at a Spanish-language paper pitched a story questioning why, with 14 unsolved homicides, the only person in cuffs was a grandmother known for pushing kids off the stoop at 9 p.m. sharp. None of that stopped the charges, but it colored the air around them. Prosecutors leaned hard on what they did have. In a conference room overlooking the river, they spread out bank statements, property tax records, con ed bills, and the thin trail from the basement card room. "We can hang her on unlicensed gambling," one aider said. "We can hang the son on fraud. If we squeeze hard enough, somebody flips on the homicides." OCCB detectives sat across the table, Spider and Shorty's photos staring up from the file. Ortiz tapped the page about benefit fraud tips. "Even if she never touches a rope," she argued, "using city systems to clear a crew is conspiracy. It's intent." Under the interrogation lights, with the lawyer at her side, Alina chose her line and stayed on it. "I called housing because my tenants were scared," she said. "I called probation because I didn't want parolees dealing in my halls. I filed forms they put in my hand at meetings you people told us to attend. You saying I should have kept quiet, let them take over my building. The Ada pushed. You called about specific men, over and over, right before they died, she countered. Alina didn't blink. I didn't tell anybody to kill them, she replied. If the world they lived in is that quick to strangle its own, maybe you should look there. By the end of that long day, no one walked out free. Arraignments waited, bail hearings, months of motions over paper crimes. But the balance had shifted. The same allies Alina once used as levers against these croupierists. Lawyers, wary but grateful tenants, now stood between her and a murder indictment. Organized crime had finally put her in a chair under bright light, proving that a web of phone calls and complaints amounted to homicide, though would be a different kind of battle. One fought with spreadsheets instead of ligatures. Asterisk. Arraignment put faces to charges, but trial turned those faces into symbols. By the time the Vega case reached Bronx Supreme Court, fall had bled into winter. Wind knifed up the courthouse steps on 161st Street, whipping at protest signs and scarves. Inside, marble floors amplified every footstep, every echo of a bailiff's shout. Reporters clustered near the metal detectors, microphones ready for whatever soundbite might make sense of a grandmother in handcuffs linked to the phrase Bronx tenement purge. Up on the third floor, courtroom 18B carried its own heavy air. Wood paneling, worn smooth, where countless palms had rested. The state seal glaring down from behind the judge's head. 12 jurors shifting on padded chairs, coats draped over the backs. On one side of the aisle, prosecutors stacked binders of financial records, phone logs, and agency memos. On the other, Alina sat at the defense table between her legal aid attorney and a private co-counsel paid for with hurried loans from cousins. Her hands were folded, rosary beads hidden in her sleeve. Opening statements painted competing portraits. The ADA's voice rang firm as she paced before the jury. This defendant, she said, used the machinery of our city to destroy 14 lives. She knew exactly how fragile those men's safety nets were and chose to cut them housing, benefits, probation. Slack then watched as they fell into strangulation, disappearance, death. She never wrapped a belt around her neck, but she built the trap. Jurors scribbled notes, some glancing at Alina, some at the blown-up timeline on the easel. Red arrows marching from anonymous complaints to morgue photos. Defense took a different route. What you'll actually see, her attorney countered, is a woman who did what the city told her to do. You'll hear from tenants who were afraid to let their kids climb the stairs past drug dealers. You'll see flyers from precinct meetings encouraging residents to say something. Call someone when crime touched their building. That's what Mrs. Vega did. She called. She filled out forms. She worked with agencies. The state wants to punish her because those agencies finally listened. He tapped the same timeline. Correlation is not conspiracy. Witness after witness walked to the stand. A housing inspector testified about overcrowding violations. Uncomfortable under cross when forced to admit he'd never met Alina before this case. An HRA caseworker describes standard fraud investigations, conceding that anonymous tips arrived daily from all over the borough. Ortiz, the analyst, traced patterns for the jury. Laser pointer, circling dates and names. Under gentle but sharp questioning from defense, she acknowledged that no email, memo, or recording tied Alina directly to any order to harm. We saw coordination, Ortiz insisted. We saw intent expressed through bureaucracy. The phrase hung in the air, abstract and unsettling. Then came the character witnesses. Mrs. Ortiz from 5F, whose grandson stopped skipping school once the hallway emptied. A bodega owner who said Alina had fronted him rent when looters smashed his window during a blackout. Father Miguel, collar straightened, trying to answer yes or no questions about vigilantism with stories of funerals and block meetings. Each one shored up the defense's central frame. Alina, as protector, not predator. A woman using official channels in a neighborhood where unofficial ones usually ran with blood. Closing arguments boiled everything down into competing moral equations. Prosecution urged the jury to look past the grandmother sweater to the spreadsheet. If you knowingly push someone off a cliff, the ADR said, you're a killer. If you strip away the protections keeping them from that cliff, knowing exactly who waits at the bottom with a rope, are you really so different? Defense pointed at the empty chairs where D and his suppliers might have sat if they weren't dead or vanished. The state can't find the men who actually tightened those belts, he said. So they brought you the landlord who called 311. Verdicts came down on a grey afternoon. The sky outside the tall windows matching the jurors' faces. Guilty on illegal gambling. Guilty on tax evasion. Guilty on maintaining an unlicensed social club. Acquittal, or no bill, on anything that hinted at homicide. The judge's gavel landed like a muted gunshot. Alina would pay fines, face probation, maybe see Manny spend time upstate for the card room. The Bronx tenement purge stayed officially unsolved. For her network, it was confirmation. Their quiet alliances had been just strong. Enough to keep the rope from looping around the matriarch's neck, even if it had closed on 14 others. Asterisk, the noise in courtroom 18B thinned out fast once the verdicts were read. Reporters packed up their notepads. The sketch artist tore the last sheet from her pad. And the jurors slipped through the side door with the dazed look of people stepping out of someone else's nightmare. Alina stayed seated until the court officer tapped the table. "Ma'am," he said, gentler than he had to be. "We're done for today." Her knees protested when she stood. Rosary beads clicking in her sleeve like a tiny metronome, keeping time with a life that had just tilted but not quite toppled. Sentencing came a few weeks later. In a smaller, less crowded courtroom. No TV cameras this time, just a few reporters and a scattering of neighbors who'd taken the bus uptown. The judge peered over his glasses at the stack of pre-sentence reports. For the gambling and tax counts, Manny drew a short upstate bid 18 months. Maybe a little less with good time. Alina got probation fines and a stern lecture about respecting the integrity of city systems. The irony of being scolded for using those systems too hard didn't escape her. She nodded anyway, as if accepting penance. Up at Greenhaven months later. The visitation room hummed with low voices and vending machine beeps. Metal chairs scraped on the concrete floor. Children's laughter bumped against the clank of doors. Manny walked in wearing a green prison uniform that hung looser than it should have, face leaner, eyes older. Alina sat at a round table by the window, a styrofoam cup of coffee cooling between her hands. When he sat, the plastic chair squealed. For a second, neither of them spoke. "You look tired, Ma," he finally said. "You look thin," she shot back automatically, the old rhythm trying to reassert itself. Conversation wandered. Lila's classes, a leak in 3F, Victor picking up extra overtime. The card room never came up by name. Instead, Manny asked, "You close it?" And Alina answered, "Basement's for storage now." "That's enough." He nodded, jaw tight, understanding more in that short exchange than words carried. The engine that had powered the building for decades was shut off. Not just paused. The money it had spun was tainted. They were letting it die. Back in the Bronx, the basement felt different without the card tables. The concrete floor, once littered with bottle caps and cigarette burns, echoed footsteps in a way that made tenants glance over their shoulders. Alina had the walls painted a brighter off-white, had Victor haul down metal shelving. Old paint cans and spare tiles took the place of folding chairs and milk crate fans. On paper, she raised a few rents within what the law allowed, applied for a small rehabilitation grant, and started paying every tax her accountant circled. The ledgers on her kitchen table grew thinner and more official. More of the ink black and less of it blue. Marisol's path bent in a quieter direction. She picked up part-time work at a non-profit legal clinic downtown. Answering phones, filing motions, watching attorneys navigate the same agencies she'd once called as a civilian saboteur. Late nights, she'd open a blank document on an old computer and type out what they'd done that samo names dates, feelings she couldn't put anywhere else. Sometimes she deleted whole pages. Sometimes she printed them and tore them into strips over the sink. Bleach bottle under the counter just in case ink bled where it shouldn't. For Lila, distance became its own form of survival. College took her off the block, then a job kept her there. When people at parties asked where she was from, she usually said, New York, and left it at that. Once in a while, on late nights with too much wine, she'd tell a trusted friend about a building where hustlers disappeared and no one ever got charged. My grandmother fought for our home, she'd say, then pause. She also played God, maybe. I'm still figuring out which part counts more. Years slid by that way. Elena's hair went fully white, her walks up the stairs slower, hand trailing the rail. New families moved in, not knowing why older tenants side-eyed any young man who lingered too long by the mailboxes. The phone numbers on the kitchen wall yellowed around the tape. Some going out of service, some answered by strangers who'd taken over old desks. The network she'd once weaponized settled back into ordinary life: priests giving homilies, lawyers filing boring motions, clerks stamping forms without thinking of the summer bodies stacked in Ortiz's files. In that settling, her victory took its final shape. The building stayed in Vega hands. The city got its fines. The murder board at organized crime gathered dust, red strings fading like old blood. Whatever name you give to what she'd done, defense, revenge, murder by bureaucracy, had finished its work. The tools were put away. Only the outcomes remained. Most stories about the Bronx tenement purge ended at the courthouse doors. With Elena's fines and Manny's short stint upstate, the lives that never made it into the official narrative went on in smaller rooms, far from microphones and legal pads. One of those rooms sat on the top floor of a 6-story in Soundview. Its living room walls crowded with photographs, framed school portraits, a faded Little League team, a Polaroid of a skinny boy holding a birthday cake. In the center, in the best frame she could afford, Shorty smiled in a tux that wasn't his, borrowed for a cousin's wedding. Around the frame, plastic flowers gathered dust. Shorty's mother kept that apartment dim, curtains half drawn to mute the glare off the next building's brick. The coffee table was an altar St. Jude candle, glass cloudy with use, a chipped ceramic virgin, a plate where offerings of hard candy and coins sometimes appeared. Every year in late July she added one new thing, a fresh obituary clipping from a yellowing folder, carefully smoothed under the candle. She'd call the precinct around that time, too, asking if there was any news on my boy. The answers never changed. Ongoing investigation, ma'am. No new information. We're doing everything we can. Eventually, the younger officers didn't even check the computer. They just repeated the script. Phone calls weren't the only way she tried to close the hole. Once, during Elena's trial, she'd sat in the gallery for a day, hands clenched in her lap, eyes tracking every mention of anonymous tipster and benefit fraud flag. Hearing the lawyers argue about systems and intent, she'd felt a cold clarity. Someone had decided her son was expendable long before a belt tightened around his neck. After that, her grief hardened into a kind of stubborn ritual. She prayed for Shorty's soul, and against everything the church had ever taught her, she prayed that whoever had set the machinery against him would someday feel what it was to lose a child to a decision made in another room. Meanwhile, fallout inside the Vega line took a different shape. Manny came home from Greenhaven, with a new stiffness in his shoulders and a silence that didn't match the quick talking kid who'd once run beers in the basement. He took a job fixing appliances in another borough, traveling in a battered van with somebody else's name painted on the side. At family gatherings he laughed in the right places, kissed his mother's cheek, asked his niece about work, but there was a gap in the conversation where cards and numbers used to be. When talk drifted toward the old days, he'd excuse himself to smoke on the fire escape, exhaling slowly into the dark, as if he could push that summer out with the smoke. Lila built distance into her adulthood more deliberately. Graduate school in another state turned into a job in another time zone. Her apartment there looked nothing like the one she'd grown up in. Open floor plan, big windows, no handwritten list of agency numbers taped by the phone. Yet pieces of the Bronx clung to her reflexes. She checked stairwells before committing to a lease. She watched who lingered by the building entrance, cataloging faces the way Alina had cataloged tenants. When co-workers stumbled on an old article about the tenement purge and made dark jokes about mobbed-up landlords, she smiled too tightly and changed the subject. The phrase my grandmother stuck in her throat whenever that case came up. Love and unease tangled there. Across the boroughs, other families carried their own versions of that tangle. Spider's mother moved to Yonkers after her landlord refused to renew her lease. Tired of reporters asking for quotes, Pito and Flaco's aunt kept their old sneakers in a bag at the back of her closet. Unable to throw them out, unable to look at them for long. Sean's cousin named a newborn after him, without quite knowing why, just that the name felt unfinished otherwise. None of them ever got the file folder satisfaction of a conviction. A headline saying killer sentenced. All they had were rumors about a building where a quiet woman had made some calls and, somehow, the men who'd run their stairwells disappeared. In that sense, Elena's network never really stopped working. The same silence that had shielded her during the investigation, neighbors who half-approved, priests who emphasized her good deeds, tenants who didn't want their own grey economies, scrutinized also kept the victims' families from ever getting more than half answers. Her victory, such as it was, lived inside that silence. So did the ache. Every birthday cake with one plate missing, every family photo with a face pasted in from an older year, was part of the cost ledger the court never saw. The ropes she'd cut for her own blood had left burn marks on other people's wrists. And those marks didn't fade just because the city stopped looking. Asterisk. Scars on wrists fade to white over time. Scars in filing cabinets don't. Down in the NYPD Records and Identification Division, 3 floors below street level, the air always ran 10 degrees cooler and smelled faintly of paper, dust, and toner. Metal shelving rose in tight rows, cardboard file boxes stacked shoulder-high with case numbers stamped in black. Fluorescent strips hummed above, making everything a flat, tired shade of grey. On an April afternoon in 2006, a young officer named Delgado wheeled a cart between the aisles, scanning labels. His sergeant, up in organized crime, had requested archival material on the Bronx tenement purge cases for a training presentation. Delgado found the box near the end of a row. Spine marked H92, 3074 through 3087. Someone years back had added, in blue pen, Vega tenement, purge. He hefted it onto the cart. Inside, folders thumped softly. A paperweight made of 14 thin lives and one family's thicker one. In a 7th-floor conference room later that week. The box sat open at the center of a long table. Detectives and analysts gathered with styrofoam cups and notepads, while a lieutenant woke up an aging projector. The slides weren't slick, just scanned memos, timeline charts, a photograph of the red string board Ortiz had once tended like a grim garden. "We're not here to solve this," the lieutenant began. "We're here to talk about how it happened and what it says about the ways people can use our own partner's housing. HRA, probationers, weapons." A slide clicked forward, dates of benefit terminations, eviction filings, probation violations lined up beside homicide dates. Ortiz, older now, hair threaded with gray, pointed with a capped marker. "Nobody forged documents," she said. "Nobody hacked a database. Somebody just knew how fragile these guys were in the system and pressed every weak spot at once. That's what we mean by network pressure. You may see it again, different borough, different players, same idea. Don't assume violence only looks like guns." Policy didn't shift overnight because of one training, but the case found its way into quiet corners of official thinking. Internal bulletins circulated, reminding detectives to watch for clusters of administrative harms, preceding violence, sudden waves of tips on the same group, patterns of coordinated complaints that looked more like campaigns than coincidence. City lawyers, burned by the optics of hauling a grandmother into court, while the actual stranglers stayed nameless, drafted cautious language about avoiding selective application of nuisance and benefit enforcement, likely to produce foreseeable harm. On paper, it sounded like care. In practice, it came down to who in which office chose to pay attention. Across town, in a municipal meeting room with bad acoustics, Housing advocates and landlord groups occasionally invoked the Vega case as a kind of cautionary ghost story. You squeeze small owners too hard, one trade group rep argued once. They'll do what that lady in the Bronx did, find their own way to clear trouble. An organizer from a tenants' union snapped back. Or, you give landlords too much leeway, and they disappear people instead of fixing boilers. The name Vega floated between them, stripped of its details, shorthand for a line crossed somewhere between calling 311 and playing judge. Among smaller landlords, the tale circulated more quietly, in back booths of diners and whispered chats after community board meetings. Heard about that building on Prospect? Someone would say, lady there ran a whole crew out without firing a shot. Another would shake his head. Yeah, and spent a year in court. I'm not trying to be her. Most of them didn't have her patience, her contacts, or her nerve. A few, under pressure, made calls a little more often, filed complaints a little more strategically, testing the edges of what the system would let them do. For OCCB rookies, the tenement purge box became a rite of passage. New detectives signed out its contents, flipped through Dr. Patel's autopsy reports, Ortiz's timelines, Ramos's notes in the margins. Some saw in it a failure they'd never nailed down who tied what knot. Others saw a different lesson. That the work wasn't just about chasing men with guns, but about noticing when ordinary bureaucratic noise arranged itself into a weapon. You miss this pattern, an older sergeant liked to say. Tapping the photocopied charts, you're already 3 steps behind the next Alina. Outside those rooms, the city kept remaking itself. The block near Prospect and Westchester sprouted a new pharmacy where an empty lot had been. A chain coffee shop 3 doors down from the bodega. Rents crept up. Different kids leaned on the same mailboxes. Most of them had never heard of decaying or spider Morales. When police pulled old files to brief a commander on historical patterns, the Vega case might get a slide or two, sandwiched between gang maps and shooting stats from more recent years. It lived on as context, not crisis. In that shift from active investigation to archived instruction, the network knockout that Vegas had executed settled into its final institutional role. Not headline, not solved crime, but warning. The system hadn't broken because of them. It had merely revealed another way it could be bent. Whether anyone outside those conference rooms truly learned from that warning is another question. That's where we turn next, away from boxes and binders and toward the larger, messier story of what justice even meant in a summer where a light envelope could set all this in motion. Asterisk, on a rainy Thursday night, years after the last file on the tenement purge was boxed, the case flickered to life again in a cramped lecture hall at a city college. Fluorescent lights buzzed, rain tapped at the high windows, and 40-odd criminology students shifted in their seats, while a professor clicked through slides, gang maps, bar graphs, then a grainy headline, 14 Street hustlers, dead in Bronx, tenement, purge, nitrogen monoxide murder charges, underneath. A smaller line, landlord convicted only of gambling, tax fraud. From the back row, it looked like any other case study. Distance flattened it, but at the front, the professor traced the timeline with the tip of a pen. Note the sequence, she said. First, the money goes missing. Then comes fear of exposure, of losing an asset. After that, you don't see guns. You see calls, complaints, benefit reviews, code inspections. The bodies arrive last. A few students frowned, pens hovering. One finally raised a hand. So, is that murder? He asked. Or is that just the system doing what it does? Conversations like that are where the Vega story really lives now. In the uneasy space between legal definitions and moral instincts. Legally, no prosecutor ever proved a conspiracy to kill. The Vegas didn't sign orders for stranglings, didn't text anyone handle it. They called numbers the city had given them. They wrote forms the agencies printed. They used the vocabulary of safety and compliance that brochures handed out at precinct meetings practically begged them to use. On paper, they were model participants in a shared project called public order. Yet lay all the timelines side by side, and another story bleeds through. 14 men, all precarious in similar ways, and probation. On vouchers, on benefits. On the edge of eviction, suddenly find every thin support yanked tight at once. Every bit of slack disappears. Each is pushed closer to a line where missed payments and nervous suppliers turn lethal. The professor called that administrative violence. But you could just as easily label it what our detectives did, a network knockout, planned and executed by someone who understood exactly how cheap the system makes certain lives. Justice, in its simplest telling, is supposed to be blind. In the Bronx that summer, it saw some things very clearly. It noticed an old woman who kept kids off her stoop and paid enough taxes to keep her deed. It found pathways to penalize her without caging her for life. It half saw 14 hustlers, enough to tag them known associates and perps when they were alive, then John Doe with a case number when they were dead. It barely saw the mothers lighting candles in cluttered living rooms, or the girlfriend in the clinic waiting room who never got to bring a baby home. Legacy threads through all of it. Alina thought she was protecting hers for crumbling walls. A name on a deed. A granddaughter in a bedroom with no bars on the window. In a terribly narrow sense, she succeeded. The building remained. The Vega name didn't end in a foreclosure notice. But legacy isn't just what you keep. It's also what you break to keep it. For every rent-stabilized lease she preserved, there's an empty chair at someone else's table. A photo on someone else's crowded wall. Her story and theirs are braided now. Whether she would have chosen the pairing or not, broken systems don't always look like chaos. Sometimes they look exactly like this. Forms properly filed. Complaints routed to the right departments. Officers following up as policy manuals suggest. Prosecutors respecting the burden of proof. Everything, technically, done right. And still a trail of strangled men whose deaths sit in a limbo between coincidence and design. When you stand back far enough, it's hard to say where individual intent ends and institutional failure begins, or whether those two ever really separate. Sitting wherever you are, phone in hand. Video playing, you get a vantage point none of them had. You see the kitchen table and the morgue. The HRA window and the warehouse on the river. The priest's homily and the OCCB briefing. You see a family's fear and a crew's bravado and a city's indifference, all knotted up. The question left, the only one that really matters now, isn't whether a judge got it technically right. It's what you call what the Vegas actually did.
And it's whether, under the same pressures, you're sure you'd have chosen something gentler than the rope they wrapped in red tape. Out on Prospect and Westchester now, it's hard to imagine any of it. The bodega's still there, but the lotto sign is newer, brighter, promising different chances. A chain pharmacy glows where an abandoned lot once soaked up heat. Strollers roll past where crews used to lean. Dog walkers snap photos of sunsets over the elevated tracks. From the sidewalk, the Vega building looks like any other rehabbed walk-up. Fresh coat of beige paint, new intercom, security camera a black bubble above the door. On a mild evening, kids drag scooters up the stoop, arguing about cartoons. Their voices bounce off the brick, clean, unafraid. A delivery guy balances a stack of pizzas on one hand as he buzzes for C, glancing once at the camera before the lock clicks. He doesn't know that 30 years ago, people would have thought twice before letting a stranger into that lobby, that certain names could close doors faster than any deadbolt. Just inside, the mailboxes shine dull brass where they used to be dented and tagged. Someone at some point ordered new ones, lined up straight with printed labels. Singh, Rodriguez, Johnson, no Vega. Elena died a few years back in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, her transferring the building to a small trust for Lila and Manny, who promptly sold it to a management company with an office in Midtown. On the deed now, a corporate name sits where a family name once did, clean, impersonal, unburdened by ghosts. Across the river, in a podcast studio with foam panels on the walls and a neon on-air sign, the case lives differently. Two voices lean over microphones, one host, one guest. We're talking today about a landlord some call a hero and some call a serial killer with a Rolodex, the host says, half laughing, half apologizing. The guest, Older, voice roughened by years in squad rooms. Laughs once, without humor. She wasn't a killer, he says. Not like the guys I put bracelets on. But she knew damn well what kind of world those boys lived in when she started pulling their safety nets. Back on the block, Marisol stands on the opposite corner for the first time in years, tote bag heavy on her shoulder. She's in town for a conference, working now for a legal nonprofit that helps people keep the benefits she once helped weaponize. The building looks smaller than it did when she was 20, the stoop narrower. For a long moment, she watches a father shepherd his toddler up the steps, one hand on the child's back. The sight twists something in her chest, satisfaction and shame in the same breath. When Lila visits, which is not often, she doesn't linger. She'll walk past on her way to the subway, eyes flicking up just long enough to count floors. From the street, you can't see the kitchen where the ledgers sat, the wall where the phone numbers yellowed, the basement where the tables folded for good. You just see windows with mismatched curtains and maybe a plant on a sill. If someone beside her mentions rising rents or how much safer the neighborhood feels these days, she presses her lips together, thinking of safety measured in 14 bodies no one was ever convicted for. For Shorty's mother, for Spider's aunt in Yonkers, for the cousins and girlfriends and children left behind, the story never closed. They don't think in terms like network knockout or administrative violence. They think in simpler, sharper lines. He called me that night and said he was scared. They said they'd look into it. Nobody ever went to jail. Once in a while, a documentary crew or a grad student finds them, notebook in hand, questions on their tongue. Some talk, some shut the door. From where you're sitting now, phone in your palm, maybe headphones on, the rest of your life scrolling just a thumb flick away, you occupy a strange vantage point. You can see Elena's fear when that envelope came up light, Dee's frustration in the phone booth, Ortiz's red pen hovering over dates, Shorty's mother smoothing a clipping under a St. Jude candle. You see systems creak and people improvise and consequences land unevenly, always harder on the ones with the least cushion. What you do with that vantage point is the only part of this story left unwritten. Do you call what the Vegas did justice? A desperate family using the tools the city handed them when cops and courts felt too slow? Do you call it murder, stretched out across agencies and weeks, with ropes made of forms and phone calls instead of nylon and leather? Or do you tuck it away as one of those things that happens in bad neighborhoods, the kind of shrug that lets the next version grow? If you've stayed with this far from simple story all the way down these halls and up these stairs, you're already not shrugging. Tell me, in the comments below, where you draw the line in a place like this. And if you want more cases that don't offer easy villains or easy saints, hit subscribe, share this with someone who still thinks violence only looks like bullets, and stay ready for the next time an ordinary building hides an extraordinary reckoning.